announced we were going to hold this session, this workshop, obviously as part of a series of workshops that are happening around Europe in this momentous week. We decided we wanted to go as near to the vote, which is taking place tomorrow in Britain, the vote in the EU elections, as was possible. And of course the trade-off is, unfortunately, it's in our exam period, so there aren't as many people as we perhaps have hoped. But nonetheless, we're delighted that some of you could join us in the room, but also online as well. And we hope it's an enlightening session. Before Nathan Ritchie and myself, I'm Dominic Wring, and I'm based here at Loughborough University. Before we talk about the EU campaign that's been unfolding in the last 3 weeks in Britain, I'd like to invite Simona Guerra to provide some of the wider context around the really extraordinary events that have been taking place in the UK, not just in the recent past, but also the more distant years and even decades. Simona is based at Leicester University, Deputy Head of Politics, and has been writing about Euroscepticism, particularly in the UK, for some time, and he's going to talk about this and some very recent data to share with us. Simona.
Thanks a lot, and thanks for inviting me, and it's my pleasure to be with you today. And my presentation is going to look at my research and then specifically at the British experience, in particular in the last 3 years, and the momentum and the emotions around the British referendum and the European experience in Britain. Why? Because I generally work on Euroscepticism and opposition towards the European Union at the public level. And generally I look at candidate countries and how this experience changes once they join the European Union. With the referendum in Britain, I found that the debate was mostly based at the emotional level, and there was not much information looking at issues. And research done by colleagues, for instance, a colleague Patrick Buisman at the University of Maastricht in the Netherlands, he has been comparing with information in the Netherlands, and he found that actually the type of information that is seen in the Netherlands is much more informative compared to the ones that we see in the case of the UK. So what we did with colleagues at the University of Surrey, we did a first survey looking at different questions, but also trying to see what type of emotions people experienced. And I did a similar survey that was fielded just 2 weeks ago. So it was run by YouGov just a couple of weeks ago, asking very similar questions. So today I will talk in general how I found an interest in looking at Euroscepticism and emotions, that is the first time I look at it, and why this is important in a country where the debate seems to polarize between Remainers and Leavers. Actually, if we look in depth at the emotional experience, we find that people live the same emotional experience, and why this is important. And then I did also, some of the questions that I had was also on how people were thinking of voting, and people are actually currently talking about the huge success of the Brexit vote, but I think if we look at turnout, is also the fact that many people probably are not going to vote, and why it is important. And this reflects also the fact of the lack of information on policies and debates and what the EU is and what the European Parliament does. And sometimes if you ask people as well to talk about the European Union, they reply, I don't know anything about the European Union. And I've asked them, and I had a sample of 1,813 people, and more than half of them cannot say one thing about the experience of Britain in the European Union. So if we look at attitudes towards the European Union, political science has generally looked at explanatory factors. And sometimes people can perceive the European Union based on domestic politics, sometimes on rational utilitarian issues. So I explain it in the post-communist region as a ratio between benefits and costs. We are going to benefit by joining the European Union, it's going to benefit my country, it's going to benefit future generations, and therefore I support European integration. In other cases, identity is a very important factor, and whether it's a more inclusive or exclusive type of identity. And the SNP in Scotland, for instance, is a good example where people feel both Scottish and British and feel also more supportive towards European integration. There has not been much, at least in political science, about emotions, and most of the recent type of analysis tend to look at anxiety or anger as type of emotions that may drive, for instance, political behavior. And by looking at Euroscepticism and by looking at how people perceive the European Union, I find that it's useful for me to understand this opposition not so much as it has been studied for political parties, but as a general rejection towards the European Union, but also as a type of pro-systemic opposition in some cases, where people think that it's fine to remain in the European Union, but you think that maybe the European Union could do better, or economically, for instance, from the left, there is opposition for this idea of liberal, neoliberal Europe. What I found interesting during the campaign was the use of images. So one of the things that I'm going to further investigate and study is to look at the way that images can mobilize people. And the image, for instance, as an example, that Nigel Farage used, has been used by Orban in Hungary at the latest general elections. So the image at the top is the one of Farage. The one at the bottom is the one that was used last year at the Hungarian election. And it's a different patch of green at the one at the bottom, and of course it changed the language or the sign, but it's the same image. So the fact that the opposition towards the European Union is always framed using very similar type of frames and logics. It's the opposition between us and them, where them is this corrupt bureaucracy. It is them leaving these borders open, in some of the cases in the newspapers, for instance, and in the letters the readers were sending, the people were saying it's Merkel's obsession for open borders. Or recently in the survey I did, some said it's Labour's and Tony Blair's obsession of letting immigrants in. So these type of frames are repeated, and these type of frames are really successful. So what we did then, we asked them how they voted and why they voted that way. And then we asked about 22 emotions, and we look at different social demographic factors. But after the elections in particular, most of the debates in Britain was based on different cohorts and different age groups. And some colleagues also work on testing whether a higher levels of turnout across young people could also change the result. And if we look actually at how people experience emotionally, this was done 2 weeks after the referendum, on the 6th and the 7th of July 2016, we find that actually young people are the ones who felt more uncertain, while instead the group of people 65 and older are the ones who felt more hopeful. Disappointment as well is quite high among young people, and the same anxiety or being afraid or being annoyed, for instance. And not so many at the time felt bored, and not so many felt remorseful. And similarly, I asked about remorse, also in the most recent one. And it's the one where people don't feel any type of remorse about their vote, which is an interesting one if compared with the Greek referendum. So I did I published an article with a Greek colleague where we were comparing the Greek and the British referendum. And if you read the comments online in the Greek referendum, Greek citizens always blame themselves. It's never politicians, it's never the European Union, it's us. We have this long history. We have our own culture, we are the cradle of culture of Europe, and we can only blame ourselves. In Britain it was the opposite. It was always blaming the other. That is very easy for people. And blaming domestic politicians, blaming the European Union and generally Merkel or Juncker and the European Commission. So what I did, I tried to look more specifically at these values. And I look at the ones that were most cited, and I look at the ones that were experienced more by the older group and by the younger group. And generally there are not many positive emotions, but generally the old group was the one that experienced the most positive ones. Some of them felt very proud, some of them felt hopeful towards the future. But there is one emotion, and I show you with the next one, that is apprehension. That is the one that has brought together most of the citizens. And apprehension is a type of emotion within the family of fear, where people feel that they lack information. And it's important because in general people may feel the need to collect more information. And there are emotions, something I'm interested in exploring as well, that tend to stay with us longer compared to others. So how long is the life of an emotion? Generally anger can be a burst of anger and then it stops, or joy is just a moment. But feelings like anxiety or apprehensions tend to stick with us for longer. So it would have been positive, that is in my conclusions, for instance, to have mini publics where people come together and talk with experts or listen to experts about different opinions or different policies, different approaches when looking at European integration. And the case of Ireland most recently is a very good example. In Belgium, the city of Brussels is doing the same. And sometimes these meetings go on for 2 years at regular times, and citizens then come to conclusions that can provide advice on how then the country can take their choices. What I did then, what I found in general before what I did, is that in general we have young people who feel more uncertain and more anxious after the referendum. In general, also half of the women feel uncertain, and men and women experience different emotions, where women feel more uncertain compared to men. A third of the people who are 65 and older felt at the time apprehensive, but also 40% of them felt hopeful and in general showed most of the positive feelings. In general, if we look at social class or their socioeconomic status and look at levels of education, generally the higher the level, the more the levels of anxiety in this group. And something interesting that may also explain a bit the case after the referendum and now before the elections. In general, people in an older age feel more confident of what they know. So we asked about whether they found the campaigns helpful and if they had accessed any time of specific information or attended any events in the campaign. Generally, young people felt that it was very useful, or it was useful, even though they didn't trust, for instance, some specific campaigns. While instead, the group between those 65 and older had a more negative opinion and felt that they didn't need that type of information. What I did at the beginning of the month, I did again a similar survey and asked half and half, positive and negative, because the one we had was more negative. So sometimes I was presenting it and I was asked, but you ask more negative ones, then you get more negative answers. So I asked for 9 positive and 9 negative, and actually there are more negative ones now than there were before. So what is particularly interesting to me is that the hopeful ones are disappearing. So also the ones who were feeling hopeful after the referendum, now it's just 4% of the sample that I have. And just 5 people out of almost 2,000 observations I have feel content about the situation. And 195 people feel sad, and most of the people feel annoyed and disappointed of what is happening. In some of their words, they talk about what it has been happening as a chaotic mess, for instance, or they feel betrayed. They are tired of what is happening, in their words, fed up with political infighting from all parties, or the fact that everyone is behaving as is becoming nasty and very personal. Some people suggest maybe we should revoke Article 50 because it's becoming a farce and no one is taking a decision. And some people also talk about the fact that the same debates are reproposed again and again, and they really feel annoyed by the fact that we cannot conclude anything to move forward. So what I did, I asked about their experience about the European Union and the experience of Britain with the European Union. If they could tell me just 4 main events since Britain joined the European Union up to today. And no one, almost no one, more than 50%, couldn't say anything about the experience of Britain from the 70s to today. In some cases, a couple of respondents just said, we joined the European Union, we had a successful rebate, we voted to leave, we leave. So there was not much about substantive answers. In some cases, 9 of them talk about the banana shape. There was something that was discussed inside the CAP because of the way, but there was nothing that the European Commission or the European Union would have done. But this was something like the poster that has remained in people's mind and really works as a trigger for opposition towards the European Union. And it works much better compared to values and norms that are based in the idea of the European Union. Solidarity is a founding value of the European Union and European integration. And only one person cited it with reference to the terrorist attack lived in London a few years ago. But has nothing to do with the European Union. It's always based on domestic politics. And 52 replied about human rights and abiding and having, like, agreeing on common values for human rights. And then some of them, when talking about immigration, talking about the Labour Party. But just a very minimal, like a fifth of my respondents replied for main events, but not so many used substantive policy-related events, which is an interesting one. And then when I asked what party they would vote for tomorrow, quite a few of them replied the Brexit party, but also quite a huge number compared to the general levels replied they would not vote or they didn't know how to vote. As in Britain generally has very low levels of turnout, not like in Slovakia where the latest ones was around 13%, but always around 32, 35, 36%. I think this is most important because there has not been a debate on what these elections have been about, and I'm interested in your talk after this to look at the debates you have found. And citizens, when talk about a possible second people's vote, people don't feel, I think that people don't know what they would vote for. So in general, I find that there has been an increasing polarization, but there has not been an increasing levels of knowledge for citizens, because asking these days, I found that citizens cannot tell even the experience of Britain in the European Union. Young people and women are the ones who feel most uncertain and anxious towards the future. And recent research done in political psychology says that this is the moment when then it can have an impact on levels of trust towards political institutions. And this could further then impact on the country and further widen the gap between generations as well. But if we look at where we are now, most people now feel annoyed and disappointed. And this can translate in the vote for the Brexit party, but can also have an impact on levels of turnout in a country where levels of turnout are very low. So since the June 2016, we had the time to bring people together instead of dividing and polarizing the debate. And possibly, even though it's a type of experience that many have commented as distant from the way that politics is done, maybe this would have had an impact on the way also how people could discuss today about the experience of the referendum and be more prepared about the experience of the European Parliament elections tomorrow. Some of my students, for instance, are commenting, I haven't looked at the programs and I don't know what to vote for tomorrow. So that would have probably helped. Also people who are generally interested about in the European Union and about the European Union.
Thank you. Simona, will you take questions?
Yes.
Yeah.
I didn't know if you wanted questions.
The opportunity
yes, of course.
to ask you about
Yeah.
this. I've got one from the floor.
Yeah, I'd just quite like to ask. So you measured for gender. Did you think about measuring maybe for occupation, or did you notice anything, any differences where people's standards of living, how they feel towards the referendum?
Yeah, we had some questions on the socioeconomic status, and we used the ABC 1C to the E type of differentiation that is used generally in this type of surveys. And generally, the higher the levels, and the more anxious and the more uncertain. One is that particularly with young people, the lower levels of education, then the higher levels of excitement or hope towards the future. And this is very close to type of analysis that has been done, for instance, by sociologists, where they have found that in some of the areas where poverty has increased, this has been like a sort of betting towards the future, changing the status quo. So probably a type of just trying to improve your own situation. Regarding gender, we found that there is a difference on the way that we generally ask for information. So we found that women, they generally discuss the referendum among friends or people they work with, while women generally look at it's the private-public type of dimension. Women generally rely on family and rely on their close network.
I may have missed this, but I wanted to check your kind of sample, the audience that you polled. So first to check, was it just amongst eligible voters from the EU referendum, or did it include, so I wonder whether it included EU citizens living in Britain who obviously weren't able to vote in the referendum. So that's really, really interesting to me. And also, obviously, with your first poll being just after the referendum in 2016 and your second poll today, there will be people who were 16 at the 2016 referendum who couldn't vote, who will now be of voting age. And obviously that was a big issue, that a lot of 16 and 17-year-olds wanted to vote in 2016 and weren't allowed. So I wonder if you have any insight on how you think that might have not skewed, but translated into your survey data.
Yeah. And that is very interesting, because in some of, they collect this data among all the population. So it doesn't matter who you are, if you are a European citizen. And in the open answers, I can see that, because some of them reply, I couldn't vote, but I wanted to vote. So I have European citizens, and of course I can have the amount of citizens, like it's proportional to the citizens today. So I always have a representative sample of British citizens between 18 up to
Yeah, that was really interesting. I mean, it's great to see, you know, those scales of emotional concepts being used. I mean, they've been used in social psychology for many, many years, of course. So, my question is, what do you think explains the decline in hopefulness among older people? Because I think that's, I mean, it's surprising enough that there was that generational divide between younger and older immediately after the referendum. But I'm wondering if you've got, because you've got a panel study going on, you can control for different variables at time A and time B. And I'm just wondering if you've seen anything in the data that, in terms of the responses to the other questions, that might help you explain what were the main drivers in terms of your data of those older people becoming less hopeful?
In general, what they deployed is, and in some of the previous analysis I did, is that what we see in what has always happened in Britain, not in changes, and our politicians are not able to take decisions. So this blaming towards politicians is further reinforcing itself by the fact that they've been able to trigger Article 50, but we are not able to take a decision and leave the European Union. And they feel quite negative and quite hopeless in the fact that they never, it's always extended. So this fact that it's always extended seems to increase anxiety in the anxiety and uncertain group and apprehension, but it increases this sense of annoyance that people have, this disappointment. So the hopeful, the old hopeful before, are becoming the old disappointed now. And while instead, if we look at how they voted for before, the disappointed ones were mostly the Liberal Democrat voter. So generally that was the type of voter. While Labour voters, for instance, were the ones who were feeling uncertain and still feel uncertain for the way that the party is not able to take a position. While old people are the ones who are really disappointed with politics and with politicians. But I can look more specifically.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's interesting if that's the story, because there's so much else to get despondent about, isn't there?
Yeah.
I mean, if it's a sense of frustration that Brexit hasn't been delivered, then that's an entirely different story, because I would have expected part of the story, and it probably is, but I suppose it's about weighing the different factors, but I would have expected part of the story to be a sense of all of the things that could go wrong with Brexit, in terms of the impact on the economy and so on. So it's interesting to see that it seems to be quite the opposite. It's kind of get on with it.
I guess that the impact of Brexit has not really happened yet. So it's also the fact that probably we will see it once we leave, within 5-10 years. So at the moment, the type of perceptions that they have is the fact that they were expecting something that is not really happening, also for their own local communities, because in most of the cases they were commenting on the NHS before, while now, for instance, in the open answers, there is no NHS. It's mainly about politics. I need to look at whether there is a relation with this particular group, which I can do.
I was struck when you mentioned about bananas, because this is a classic story. I mean, the European Commission called it a Euro myth that was propagated by certain journalists who went to Brussels and Strasbourg to report on the business of the Commission and the European Parliament back in the early to mid-1990s. And one of the prominent correspondents who went to reporting this way was none other than Boris Johnson, the future Foreign Secretary. And who knows, anything could happen in the next week or so, and he might be installed as our next leader. We wait to see. But he did make his name on the basis of, he wasn't the only person who wrote about the infamous bending bananas, and of course this was fiercely resisted by the Commission. But it's interesting how it creeps into the narrative here. But also, I notice human rights, and of course you can say human rights associated with, the European dream and pan-European ideals. But also there's that negative kind of connotations as well, where they're criticising the interference and the loss of sovereignty. So it can be quite a problematic use of the terms. And of course, correct me if I'm right, but I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but is this also the confusion that many people have about the European Commission of Human Rights, the European Human Rights legislation, which is distinct and separate from the Council of Europe, part of the Council of Europe.
Yes, and the European Council of Europe and the Council as well of the European Union. People just bring them together, and that is why I think mini-publics or regular mini-publics could be helpful, because sometimes we have this correlation between levels of education and support for the European Union, but actually the population is made up of different age groups or people. So it would be useful for everyone to talk about the European Union in very simple ways, because in simple ways, banana shapes or measure sizes are important for everyone, and so it's important for them to talk about them. And some of the legislation is moving more towards this type of issues, where they may have talks at the local level, but I think that it may need a more regular type of measure about this type of organizations. So creating this type of mini-publics regularly, bringing together people maybe once a month or once every 2 months, and listening to people who know about, I don't know, how the media can use, for instance, very simple messages or images, or why people think about the Butter Mountains that is from the 70s and
of course,
one of the first CAP.
Yeah.
And why they're still talking about banana shapes instead of talking about cooperation, for instance, on climate change or human rights or on whatever is important today for our everyday life. I think this would really make a change. Yes.
Well, thank you ever so much. It's great to see you back at Loughborough.
My pleasure to be
I've
back.
staffed here for some years, and it's great to see you. Thank you very much for that. Because Simona's really helped to set the kind of context very well in terms of how voters and the British public perceive the issues related to Europe, complex issues therein, and the kind of general mood in the country, which explains so much. Nathan and I are going to now move to talk, Nathan Ritchie and myself. We've been working with Simona Guerra and also colleagues in the European Elections Monitoring Centre who contacted us a few weeks ago when it was somewhat uncertain as to whether the UK was going to participate in this election, and asked us if we'd be involved. And hopefully we've been not so much of an awkward partner in the way that Stephen George famously wrote about Britain 3 decades ago, at the time that the kind of debate about whether Britain should further integrate with the European community, stroke the European Union as it became, was becoming quite lively. And I'll talk a bit about the context around that shortly. And of course, you know, since that time, Britain's often been portrayed as something of a stick in the mud, to say the least, in terms of its relationship with Europe. And many of our politicians have had plenty to say about Brussels. And of course, a poll was taken on Saturday of what our fellow European citizens think of us, and this was the result. You may have stayed up and seen Britain's astounding, or the UK I should say, astounding performance in Eurovision. Remarkably, of the public votes, Britain managed to get 3 points from the Irish citizens, which is really quite remarkable given the backstop debate and the kind of implications it has for our friends in the Republic. So maybe Michael Rice, the British central, at least achieved something. But it is, I think, a kind of one indicator of how Britain, the UK, is perceived on the continent. So we find ourselves in this extraordinary moment in British politics, and it seems to have been going on now for since the 2016 referendum, the recent general election in 2017, this remarkable issue around Britain's relationship with the European Union and the proposed Brexit that's not been delivered yet. And even today there's been febrile discussion. This is a headline from the Daily Telegraph about Theresa May's latest attempts to try and resolve this crisis, this issue that threatens to destabilise and finally end the premiership. And this could happen at any time because people are having meetings apparently at Westminster. But at least 2.5–3 weeks ago, the government actually confirmed that Britain were going to participate in this election, and hence our involvement as the UK team in this pan-European project. And interestingly, David Livingstone, who is effectively Theresa May's deputy, only confirmed British citizens were going to vote on the 7th of May, which was interestingly the final day you had to register to participate in the poll. So, you know, really it's kind of says how, you know, 11th hour, in fact it's beyond 11th hour, it's now 11, sort of 5 to midnight, this whole process has been very much last minute. And we find ourselves in this extraordinary kind of election campaign. Some of the projections, and there have been many, about what might happen, we won't find out until Sunday, I think, when the votes are all counted and the results are released. But there have been various projections about what might happen. These are based on those taken a few weeks ago on behalf of Remain United, an anti-Brexit group, which developed some data, issued some data based on a consultancy called Electoral Calculus, and they kind of give some indication as to what they think might happen. Of course, this is all speculation, but broadly speaking, it suggested that Brexit Party are going to win the election with 28 seats, and this is quite remarkable for a group that didn't exist and wasn't launched until January, 3 months ago. So it's really quite extraordinary, or 4 months ago, January the 20th. So it's a brand new party formed not explicit to fight these elections, but because this is its first major political contest. And similarly, Change UK, on the Remain side of the fence, has really not had a great campaign, and Nathan and I will talk about this later. It's been a rejuvenation for the Liberal Democrats, which have been struggling in recent years in terms of their polling figures, so this may give them a fillip. And of course, for the governing Conservatives, it looks set to be a disaster. And the projection here is 6 seats, which is down from 19 that they won in 2014, the last time we went to the polls. Notice as well, UKIP, which normally won the election in 2014, faces a wipeout. Of course, many of their members and major figures have moved over to the new Brexit party cause. It is the anniversary of our first ever elections, European elections in the UK, and really you couldn't have a more striking contrast with the position of the governing Conservative Party and the newly elected Conservative Party that stormed the first ever direct elections from Britain to the Strasbourg, Brussels Parliament. The Conservatives won the lion's share of the seats. It was on a different electoral system. A majoritarian won, and they just obviously won 3/4 of the seats on a 51% vote share. Extraordinary. They even returned, and anybody knows the recent politics of Liverpool, they even returned a Conservative member of Parliament there, which says it all of how absolutely solid was the vote for the then ruling Conservatives, led by Margaret Thatcher. That's an image not of her from the '79 campaign, but actually a few years before, just after she'd been installed as leader, and carrying on a very much a pro-integrationist message, as she famously campaigned in a jumper in the referendum in '75 to confirm British membership of the then EEC. And having replaced Ted Heath, who was famously Europhile, it confirmed that Margaret Thatcher wasn't necessarily going to deviate significantly, at least at that time, from Conservative policy of supporting Britain's membership in the then what we call the common market. Since then, since 1979, there's been a squeeze on the Conservative vote, and indeed the Labour vote as well. And you see there a pattern of change over some times, and the rise of other political formations, not least there in purple, the United Kingdom Independence Party, formed in 1993, and really making a breakthrough significantly in 1999 with its first members being elected. And you can see there the growth of other political shades of opinion as well, which in part is reflecting the kind of growing scepticism in certain sections of the British public. Three electoral milestones to note in particular. The Green surge from nowhere. I mean, 1984 European elections, they got 70,000 votes. In 1989, they got 2.3 million. I mean, that's a better result than I think we're even expecting in this election, although we'll see, obviously, in a few days' time. But really quite a striking development. And there's a famous party election broadcast and advert put out at the time on television. You see there the chart being covered in all kinds of pollutants. And that really struck a chord as the Green agenda was particularly kind of making the headlines in Britain, as indeed it was elsewhere. That's obviously 30 years ago. They didn't, however, win any representation because, again, the majoritarian system that was in place prevented smaller parties such as themselves breaking through. 2009, it's been forward a bit. We see the election of far-right MEPs, 2 of them for the British National Party, which was something of a wake-up call in terms of British political discourse, but reflected the growing scepticism that had been expressed by various different politicians, and particularly in that kind of party's manifesto. And then, following the most recent European elections in Britain, 2014, see UKIP, United Kingdom Independence Party, topping the poll and winning 24 seats. Interestingly, on a slogan, if you read it, take back control of our country. And that take back control was the centre point of formed a centrepiece of a recent drama starring Benedict Cumberbatch, the famous actor who played the strategist who led the Leave campaign in the 2016 referendum. And if you follow that drama, it's very much seen as he's the genius behind the take back control message. But we see it there in bold yellow and purple expressed by UKIP, and clearly, you know, it questions the narrative of that particular drama, because when we see, obviously, the message so boldly declared in 2014, it's been around a bit longer than some people supposed. And interestingly, talking about the referendum in 2014, it was part of the discourse, not just of UKIP, but also some of the other parties, the Remain supporting Greens, for instance. There's Natalie Bennett, the leader, talking about a referendum being something that her party would endorse at some stage. And similarly, Ed Miliband there, talking also about a referendum when he was the Labour leader and the potential Prime Minister, acknowledging, you know, that there was scepticism within the British public and that this would need to be, you know, potentially put to a referendum if Britain was to further integrate with our colleagues in the continent. And of course, famously, the Conservatives stood on a manifesto in the 2014 campaign, promising to hold a referendum in 2017. And one wonders what might have happened, whether it would have been the vote that we had in 2016, had been held out as promised way back in 2014. But as it was, David Cameron kind of went to the country a year earlier, and we know what happened on that fateful week. So I want to mention turnout, which has been very low. In fact, historically, Britain's been the lowest turnout in the EU elections. I think now some of the new accession countries are even lower. Portugal, I think at some stage, replaced us as the lowest participating country. But we've fluctuated between 32 to 39% over the years, and who knows what's going to happen. You know, tomorrow it's going to be quite interesting, that speculation about that. Some people are campaigning against it. Some Remain supporters obviously see this election very much as an opportunity to offer an opinion about what's happened in the last 3 years and indeed beyond that. So yeah, I mean, Britain's been there, potentially, you know, particularly low turnout, and in fact in 2004 there was actually, you know, 24%, which is kind of even by British standards was fairly lame. So as I said, we've been part of a 28 university consortium, and we're the British partners, and we're very pleased to be involved in this interesting network, analysing the campaign, a momentous campaign, you know, not least in Britain, for various reasons I've explained. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Nathan, who's going to talk a bit about the study itself and the methodology, the rationale, and what we've been looking at. And then we're going to provide a flavour of some of the key images from the last few weeks for the record, because I think it's going to be quite interesting looking at the imagery compared to, you know, other countries' experiences, which is obviously what this project is all about. Nathan.
Yeah, cheers, Don. So yeah, this is one of a network of workshops that have been on the EEMC website. It's quite interesting to point out Czechsit Nebu Hadro. I think this is means obviously Czechsit or core, meaning sort of do we go towards the core countries of the EU, do we move closer to them, or do we leave? It's quite interesting that other European countries are having their own debates about this. So I'll explain to you a bit about the methodology. So it's a real-time content analysis of promotional material from the official Facebook accounts of the UK-wide parties. I'm only coding posts that have been related to the European elections, and aside from the sort of rich data that that's going to provide us, it's also a contribution to an EU political ad archive, so anyone can access that. It's going to be, I think, a great tool for researchers in the future, because they've translated everything into English for us. So, you know, if we want to do a comparative analysis, then, you know, it particularly can be utilised for that. And as I say, my focus here will be a Facebook campaign. This is actually a example of a sort of guerrilla ad on the streets. There's been very few little examples of actually political ads on the streets because of the unexpected nature of the campaign. And this is the sort of what the code book looks like, just for our audience here. This is sort of what I've been up to. This is what I see daily, and it's asking us just really simple sort of coding. You know, what politicians are present, what is the focus of the posts. You know, is the post rational or emotional? Does it focus on the European national dimension, among many other things? So we can define our political parties in kind of different ways as we used to, going from left to right to now Remain and Leave. Sort of inter-party, but also inter-factional divide we have now. So you can obviously, there's the UKIP party being established party for many years, then you have the newly formed Brexit party, then you have the three sort of staunch Remain parties, Greens, Lib Dems and Change UK, and then you have more sort of these ambiguous stance on Brexit, Labour and Conservatives. And it's important to look at sort of their Facebook presence. What is their reach? Labour, well over a million likes on their Facebook page. UKIP surprisingly have a strong Facebook presence, whilst Lib Dems have failed to establish themselves. Brexit Party currently surging, they're going to reach Lib Dems soon, I think. I've been keeping an eye on it. And Change UK have really struggled to get any type of following online. So firstly, I'll go over the two Leave parties. I'll sort of give you an overview of the campaign, giving you some of the imagery, some of the examples I've been looking at. Here we have, obviously, UKIP, Nigel Farage's ex-party, and Nigel Farage's new party, the Brexit Party. And he has such an intense schedule. He's here, there, and everywhere at the moment. He was close to my hometown, Wolverhampton, recently, and he's the most prominent character of this campaign, no doubt. And I often think that people are quite lazy in their comparisons of populist leaders. It's easy to say, Farage has similarities to Trump, but there's no doubt from a sort of communication standpoint that the camera shots, the angles, it's all sort of based on the Trump campaign. Obviously Farage has learned a lot from Trump, as Trump's campaign learned a lot from the Brexit campaign also. So to sort of prove my point, Farage, if you take the leaders and how many times they appear on their own Facebook page, Farage is clearly the face of the European election campaign. The UKIP leader Gerard Batten following. Cable is sort of having a renaissance at the moment after the local election success of the Lib Dems. And as you can see, May and Corbyn are somewhat in hiding. So let's have a look at some of the figures of the Brexit Party. A shade of blue, referring to their Conservative links. Anne Whitcomb, probably the most famous figure of the new Brexit Party, was obviously an ex-minister, and she was MP for 30 years. If you cut her in half, she bleeds blue. Richard Tice was a former donor, and now he's the Brexit Party chairman. He also once considered running for mayor for the Conservative Party. And then there's Annunziata Rees-Mogg. She was a parliamentary candidate in 2010. She was then known as Nancy Rees-Mogg. And she's the sister, probably most famous now for being the sister of Jacob Rees-Mogg, the MP for the Conservative Party. The other voices are very diverse in nature, not just in terms of ethnicity, but in terms of occupational background. Here you have Ben Habib, a businessman. You have Elizabeth Badebe, who's a lawyer. Michael Heaver, who was a member of the UKIP party. June Murray, she's a leading figure in the fishing associations. So it's a mixture of people from many different backgrounds. You could say also trying to combat this sort of stigma which UKIP faced as being sort of a racist or white male-dominated party. This is an attempt to counteract that sort of image. And the main theme of the Brexit Party is democracy, democracy, democracy. Do you really live in a democracy? If Britain won't set an example for democracy, who will? And this is sort of the only kind of theme that they're focusing on. There's no sort of, they're very, very thin on policy. It's just about democracy and the undemocratic politicians of today. You can see here was a screenshots from a video where Sadiq Khan, John Major, Chuka Umunna, George Osborne are saying, that this referendum is the only chance you have to have your say, and then it sort of contrasts to other politicians reneging on that. You have Emily Thornberry on a recent interview with LBC saying that she's after a second referendum. Justin Greening there, John McDonnell. It's quite interesting seeing John McDonnell on TV, sort of walking that balance between trying to appease both the Remain and Leave sensibilities of Labour members. Both Leave parties have common foes, and it's the European community. Guy Verhofstadt is the most vilified from the Brexit Party campaigns, and UKIP. And here you have Schulz, the former president of the European Parliament. UKIP are divided in two, and this is reflected in the Facebook posts. Mike Hookham, the deputy leader, has a lot of the posts are shared from his personal account, and they're very different stylistically to Gerard Batten. Gerard Batten's is sort of like this sort of amateur style of being on the bus, just being interviewed. Whilst Mike Hookham tends to be it's a very negative campaign he's running, but it's much more sort of web card based. It's interesting. Obviously, it looks like there's going to be a change in UKIP leader. It'll be interesting to see whether Mike Hookham just take over, and whether this sort of Facebook post has already told me that. UKIP focus on their MEP candidates more than any other party. Obviously, the clear standout there is Carl Benjamin, who the controversial sort of Sargon of Akkad, who's recently been under the cosh about comments made about Jess Phillips. What's most interesting to me is the post in the middle. Elizabeth Jones is probably the only example of a female candidate, and you can see that they really sort of put an emphasis on the fact that she's a glamorous campaigner, but yes, we have a young woman campaigning for us. If you look at the quotes, the comments just below, you can see that young people is the first one, looking good there ladies is another. I thought it was particularly interesting to see how present she is in the Facebook posts. And UKIP, I suppose the bus these days has sort of connotations, especially since the referendum. But I believe that Change UK also have a bus and the Brexit Party. But it's only UKIP that sort of constantly posts about this bus. And as you can see, it's mostly just coastal towns that they're visiting, as opposed to the Brexit Party who are going everywhere. And this is they still have some policy. Well, Brexit Party have Finland policy, UKIP sort of, and if you've been following UKIP's sort of arguments at all, they are sort of saying, well, Brexit Party have no policy. We are the party of policy. And many of these policies and many of these themes are from, I think, from previous European election material. Fishing industry is probably the most prominent theme. Anti-EU integration, the EU Defence Union. Let's go WTO, which is sort of synonymous with this hard Brexit language now. And what I found, maybe I'm sensitive to it, but what I found probably the most disturbing picture, and it sort of harks to this sort of turning point imagery, is the post on the far right there, sorry, to your left. And this is actually about migration, but it's also about housing, blaming migration for housing. And there's something uncomfortable about this sort of posting of just massive amounts of people. So Dom's going to explain a bit about the Remain campaign now to you.
Yeah. So there is obviously battle going on for voters, and it seems to be between the Brexit parties on the one side, vying for the support of those who want to, express, reaffirm their commitment to Britain leaving the EU, but also on the Remain side, there's quite an interesting battle going on between different parties that align themselves with People's Vote or a second referendum or a final say, or however you phrase this. And there are three And in some ways they also parallel what we've just seen from Nathan, in that some of these parties are very sort of singularly focused on the EU issue, and in the case of the Greens, they're like UKIP, are very interested in mobilising opinion on a range of issues, and not just the Leave Remain debate. And we've been tracking these as well, and it's been quite interesting looking at the parties, because what's striking, and Nathan's made references, the Lib Dems have recently done quite well in local government elections that have just been held a few weeks ago. We were expecting these to be the only elections to be held this year, but now of course we're in this referendum, and we may have another general election because of the kind of febrile nature of the British politics at the present time. And both the Lib Dems and the Greens have really received a fillip from the recent local elections. The Change UK, which, like the Brexit Party, is a new campaign organisation, a new political party, set up to explicitly campaign on the EU issue and membership of it, and finds itself fighting its first political contest. So it's very interesting to look at their campaigning, and it's been somewhat insipid, to say the least. And there's interesting reasons as to why that might be, but really it doesn't seem to us anyway that they've taken the opportunity to really, prosecute their case. We'll explain a bit more about that. So looking at the Lib Dems, they're taking kind of strike in kind of British popular culture. Those of you over, well, actually you know about this album earlier, Nathan, I was asking you the other day. I remember it coming out and causing a stir in the 70s. But a kind of reference point, the Sex Pistols, never mind the bollocks. Well, I don't know if European popular culture will associate with that reference, but Google it if you don't know what that means. But anyway, it's been a kind of riposte from a conventional Westminster political party like the Liberal Democrats, who usually, quite kind of reserved in their language, and obviously, wanting to express their anger and emotion about the situation that they find themselves in. And interestingly, Vince Cable, who was a former cabinet minister in the coalition government led by David Cameron between 2010 and 2015, he then became leader after the 2017 general election, and the party struggled since the last few years, but it seems to have found a purpose again. And although he was declaring that he was going to stand down, I think he's going to stand down in the next few weeks, he really, I think, has enjoyed this campaign and has seen the rejuvenation of his political party. And interesting, looking to the future, this campaign is quite interesting to see who's potentially going to be the next leader of the Liberal Democrats, and in perhaps a stronger position than they've been in for some years since Nick Clegg was the Deputy Prime Minister. You've got Ed Davey on the screen there, and Joe Swinson, the current Deputy Leader, potential candidates to replace Cable. And they've been very noticeable in the online campaign, whereas Leila Moran, who's been suggested that she may well be the next leader, she's been virtually absent, at least until the final stages of the campaign over the last few weeks. So that's something perhaps to note as we enter a period of change for that political party in the next month. On the Green side, there is a new person fronting their campaign, Majid Majid, who's a councillor, a local government representative from Sheffield, an industrial city, one associated long time with the Labour Party. He's from Somali background, and he's one of the youngest councillors ever elected, and currently holds the honorific position of Lord Mayor of his home city. And as you can see there, representing kind of green values of internationalism, anti-racism, and obviously seeking to reach out to those pro-Remain young voters, in fact, part of your study, with very clear messaging there. And also, as I said before, the Greens have a manifesto, and are very much pushing several different policies to differentiate themselves from Labour, but also the Brexit parties and indeed the Liberal Democrats. And you can see there a range of their messaging over the last few weeks that appeared on their social media. By comparison, Change UK have been somewhat muted. There was an attempt to provide a viral video the other week with a doctor speaking about the health service. Not quite sure how that is linked to Europe in particular, but obviously the perhaps loss of staff who are from the continent, potential of a Brexit situation, that might be the message, but it's not necessarily that clear. And there's a general kind of expression about how Brexit's wrong, but they're somewhat muted in terms of how they are promoting themselves. And Leicester Times correspondent, the Times is kind of a pro-Remainish paper, to comment that they are looking old, grey and irrelevant, which is somewhat problematic for a new force that's supposed to be dynamic and changing the country and certainly the political debate. And you've seen various people who are pretty media savvy. Heidi Allen, who's currently the acting leader there, former Conservative colleague Anna Soubry, again is a former TV presenter who has been fronting out various things in an attempt to gain some viral interest. And Gavin Esler, a former BBC journalist, as well as alongside Chuka Umunna, who's probably one of the most prominent spokespeople. But their campaign really hasn't caught fire. I mean, there have been various interventions, and they do get a lot of conventional media coverage, and they've attempted to obviously use this in their online promotions. But it's been something of a disappointment. They've not really cut through it, we would see when we compare it to the other Remain supporting parties. Nathan said that Corbyn and May have been relatively absent from this campaign, and indeed that's fair to say also of their parties and their fellow politicians in the respective Labour and Conservative camps. Labour does have a policy agenda and plays to issues that have been addressed by the Greens. In particular, you see some of the images there represented on screen, but they haven't really said an enormous amount about the EU, as Nathan mentioned. And that's reflected here in the postings in the 3 weeks of the campaign that we've been monitoring. And this is obviously monitoring that's happening all over Europe, and we're part of this process. In the last 3 weeks, that's an indication of who's posting. And UKIP, I mean, has kind of an enormous amount of volume of material, some of it quite indisciplined in terms of its messaging. The Brexit Party more focused around the substantive issue of leaving and supporting that democratic vote. The Lib Dems, focused on politics of Brexit and stridently attacking the process. The Greens, as we've seen, very much youth-oriented campaigning. Change UK is somewhat muted. The quality and the quantity of their communications has been somewhat absent from this campaign. And Labour saying very little. But strikingly, the governing party is nowhere. I mean, not saying anything that's EU-related, such as the kind of perhaps concern that they don't want to offend anyone potentially in the party. But then it's not stopped anyone talking pretty much freely anyway about. But it is really quite a striking statistic. There's no EU-related activity by the Conservatives in a campaign that they are supposedly standing in to try and win seats. We did have, and you were quite surprised or pleased about this, we did finally have them saying something about that word chaos, which has probably come back to haunt Mrs May. Famously, Theresa May stood in the 2017 national elections promising not to offer a coalition of chaos in the event of winning the elections. And it's been somewhat difficult for her to articulate a message in the party to offer a coherent vision of what they are standing for. I'll turn back to Nathan, because you've been noticing some of this negative messaging. It's quite interesting. Who are the parties in this emotional campaign attacking? Who do they mention? And you want to talk a bit about this, Nathan?
Sure, yeah. So obviously Conservatives, as Don pointed out, have not been active at all. I've not declared anything for the Conservatives, but they have been attacked. This is where they're present on other people's Facebook accounts. I think this sort of she betrayed us sort of harks back to that sort of distrust in our politicians. I think particularly the UKIP one here to sort of imagery from Snow White. I don't think any of the professional parts, the other parties would do this. Type of, it's a bit. But this is UKIP attacking Labour, mainly Corbyn, his Yvette Cooper. Obviously, they kind of see Labour as sort of vulnerable ground. These sort of previous Labour heartlands are now sort of being attacked on all fronts. Richard Corbett has been negative posts about him throughout the campaign, the MEP for Yorkshire and North Lincolnshire. The only example I could find of sort of this sort of Marxist flags and stuff like that was this one. And as you can see, I think when I say amateur, I mean that probably anyone could do this at home type of post by UKIP. Whilst the Brexit Party have a more professional nature to their posts, there's a series of videos which Brexit Party put out which have sort of these former stalwarts of Labour, Tony Benn, Peter Shaw's, and they sort of contrast this with what sort of Brexiteer Labours are saying now. Steve Adonis, Lord Adonis has been obviously made this quote on LBC, and both UKIP and Brexit Party throughout the campaign have sort of focused down on him. The Lib Dems also having a go at Labour. I suppose Labour Party are sort of suffering in that no one knows whether they'll remain or leave, so that makes both parties attack them from all angles. Here is a sort of old stock footage again of Jeremy Corbyn making an anti-EU stance 30 years ago, and now I say, and he wants Brexit now. Here's Ed Davey and Joe Swinson unveiling a poster in London, anti-Corbyn. A vote for Labour means leave. And this is mentions of other parties from, from the different accounts. You can see here that Labour in red have been the most critical poster towards them. Also the Tories. If you actually look, obviously Dom showed you the amount of Facebook posts. If you actually look at it percentage-wise, Lib Dems have the most negative campaign, more than any. But also Brexit Party have been challenged by Labour, as I'll show you soon, and Change UK, but not to the levels of Labour. And because they haven't had such an aggressive campaign at all, Labour and Conservatives, they're sort of the online content is all bashing them without much retaliation. The Greens, however, haven't focused on the Brexit Party or Leavers. They're focused on being the strongest Remain party. I thought particularly, in the middle is probably my sort of favourite post of the whole campaign in terms of its creativity. You've got the Labour red, the Lib Dem sort of yellow, and then you've got the hot air balloon of the Greens rising above these two rocks. You have also sort of traffic light system. Labour won't stop Brexit, backed fossil fuel back cats. Lib Dems aided and abetted austerity, and could be dangerous. I thought that was quite interesting, could be dangerous. So they're also on the offensive, the Greens, as they sort of sense that their local election success might also be translated to a European election success. And Labour have decided to retaliate against sort of this, what Corbyn sees as this sort of rise of the far right, stressing its stuff across Europe. Our response is to strengthen our ties with working class and progressive movements, both at home and abroad. As sort of the Labour Party act as if they don't want to define people as Leave and Remain. They're trying to sort of warn people against this far right movement. This referring to Farage's former comments about saying that he's the only Thatcherite left. And they sort of, what they've done here is, obviously this is an attack of Batten and Robinson, but Batten and Robinson aren't really what they're trying to, who they're trying to attack here. They're trying to attack Nigel Farage, putting them in with these two, especially Tommy Robinson. You could pretty much say he's far right. Joe Batten would probably dispute that. And here's some quotes on Islam that Joe Batten and Tommy Robinson have said some controversial comments, and then Nigel Farage. Famous quote about him being on a train and that he couldn't hear any English voices. Pass you over to Dom to conclude here.
Yeah, just to wind up really, the European-wide study is still being obviously collected and materials being analysed, but a second report was recently released in the last few days, looking at some of the figures from all of the member states and participants in the study. And just a couple of things to share with you. Here's one about emotional versus rational as they define it in terms of the messaging that's been promoted, and this is primarily on social media, but not exclusively. Certainly in the British case, it's primarily in social media terms, because we've been looking at Facebook, and that's been really where the campaign's been at. But on this analysis, it would seem that Britain's not particularly an outlier. It's not particularly emotive in the way that's, I mean, Denmark, I mean, that's interesting as an outlier. Denmark seems to be, I think it's about 95% of its messaging is emotive rather than rational. Kind of think of the Danish as somewhat cerebral, don't you? But obviously, I don't know, you know, that's, well, it'll be interesting to drill down. But certainly Britain doesn't appear to be an outlier, the UK, the second column there on the left. However, when we switch to negativity around Europe, Britain very much is an outlier. No surprises, particularly thinking about Simona's comments earlier, and some of the material we've seen today from our presentation. And we're, you know, that big red column there represents the sort of hostility towards Europe, and a lot of that was clearly generated by the pro-Brexit campaigners, not least UKIP, which have been really quite prolific in terms of their social media material and promotions. And interesting, in the Netherlands, it's quite negative about Europe, particularly interesting because they did particularly well on Saturday, the point I entered in, winning Eurovision. And some wag at the Daily Mirror, a Remain supporting newspaper in Britain, has recently suggested that we might know the identity of the entrant, because Mrs May will have a bit of time on her hands to perfect her performative skills, but the same newspaper in question doesn't necessarily hold out much hope for her improving on our position in this year's contest. Watch this space. Thanks very much for your time and for listening, and also for those of you online. I hope you found something out more about British politics. We're still trying to disentangle what is going on, and who knows, there will be more dramatic events in the next few days and no doubt months as we look forward to see, you know, when and where this Brexit process takes us. But thank you very much for your time, and all the best. Questions?
A couple of questions. One that is coming from one of the latest things that you showed, recent research that had been done on the 2014 European elections found that actually the UK was the outlier, where there was no objective information in the newspaper. So it seems that this is the same that is happening. There is no positive, no objective ones, but quite negative ones. And why is this happening? Is it at this time a sort of Brexit legacy, or is it really the type of, as your media studies people, is it the type of media that we have in the UK? And another one, it seems that the type of debates is really looking at May, and the most negative one, or the more nasty ones, as it was often I found in the open answers in my service, seems to have her as a target. And is this type of gender issue may further help this negative campaigning, or do you find that as a type of UKIP as well as within the UKIP group has had issues with, for instance, women MEPs in the previous legislature? So I was wondering whether you have found something there that exists.
Well, if you want to take the second part,
yeah, sure.
And I'll just perhaps comment on the mediated nature of this discourse. I mean, I think what's striking, this campaign hasn't caught the media's imagination. I mean, the public service broadcasters in Britain, the BBC and the commercial rivals are obliged to report on this, but it hasn't really been a major part of the news. So much else has been happening. I mean, today, on the eve of the poll, there have been other dramatic stories about the collapse of the British Steel company, and also a major restaurant chain. And, you know, even Mrs May's latest attempts to conclude the Brexit process and the spectre of a possible second referendum vote have, you know, basically overshadowed news about the campaign. It's been really quite extraordinary that there hasn't really been, perhaps it's not so extraordinary, but there hasn't been really what you might imagine with this national vote taking place tomorrow, kind of much of an interest. So the parties themselves at the late stages in which they entered this campaign, they didn't expect to be running strategies, communicating, promoting themselves in this way and for this vote tomorrow. You know, I think if the media's had influence, it's probably a legacy of the last 25, 30 years and the discourse around Europe and how people respond and understand and identify if they identify much. And you made the point that people aren't necessarily that engaged with the issues. So we see a lot of familiar kind of images there, very hostile towards certain politicians, and this turning over to Nathan, the spectre of treachery in terms of the present government, the Prime Minister in particular, has been raised. And it certainly seems to me, you talk about UKIP, I don't think an orthodox British political party would put that messaging out about her demonisation of Theresa May in quite the same way. But it hasn't had much of a reaction because UKIP itself seems to be marginalised by the Brexit parties. We've demonstrated with the campaign to some extent, but also the polling suggesting it might be a wipeout for the party that still bears that name.
Yeah, I'll just go back to that slide. I think it's interesting. I wanted to just give sort of an overview. We had so much to cover in a short amount of time, but it was something which, especially UKIP, the Leave parties especially, are aggressive in their tone, and Theresa May is sort of, I like this use of she betrayed us, and you can only, and the woman with the apple, it sort of symbolises this sort of, goes back to sort of the Adam and Eve sort of, don't trust her, you can't trust her. The other parties, I don't see any sort of examples of this sort of obvious attack, but yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you point that out, because if I was sort of discussing this in more depth, I would have gone into this type of imagery, for sure. Yeah, Theresa May, she's always singled out on her own, rather than just the party. Whilst Corbyn, if you go to the Corbyn posts, a lot of the time it's about Labour. Labour wants a second referendum. Labour wants a second ref. Labour is now a Marxist party. I have Corbyn in the picture, but the focus won't be sort of attacking him personally. Whilst with Theresa May, yeah, there's an obvious difference. I didn't find any examples of other attacks on other Conservative members at all. So no Rob, Johnson, they're not being attacked. Whilst with Theresa May is sort of from the outset. This by Theresa was one of the first ones I coded as well. So yeah.
In the Daily Telegraph as well, in your first lines, one of the first lines you had, there is just Theresa May and different images of Theresa May.
I do feel especially UKIP and Brexit have a different tone when they're talking. I'd like to go into further detail at some point about that, but I think that's a good observation. Yeah.
Any other questions?
I wondered about the coding of the emotional and rational language. Is there kind of specific guidelines within the code book for that, or is it more of like a...
Yeah, so there's certain sort of key words that, okay, I can actually see it. So it will say you've got to code for emotional, and then some of that will be anger, disgust, hate. Some of that will be fear, threat, insecurity. There's other sort of pride, membership, ambition. Whilst rational will be competence, knowledge, reliability, concrete data and statistics. And I think there's another one. And then you have like neutral tone. Obviously, I mean, if you have so many coders with not much intercoder reliability between the two, it's interesting to see where, to what extent in certain languages do they. It'll be you can have questions about the coding procedures, I guess, but yeah, there are more guidelines than just emotional, rational, but it is difficult to sort of.
So this code book as well is consistent across all 28?
Yeah, which has been another sort of methodological boundary because the unique nature of the UK campaign means that often, 80% about Brexit. So we have a category for Brexit. What would have been perfect is if I could have a sub-theme. I would have been able to find out more about, so it's mentioning Brexit, but what element of Brexit? There are 3 themes, but it's not, I suppose, that's the problem with, trying to be uniform across all the different nationalities. But yeah, so, yeah.
Okay, unless there's any final comments, thanks to everybody again for coming, much appreciated, and thanks to you at home, wherever you are. I hope you found it very, very interesting. From what one of my continental colleagues used to call the island. We don't know quite long how we'll be still in the EU, if at all, but it looks like our last election for the foreseeable. I think that's a reasonable, maybe, who knows. But thank you very much for your time, and all the best. Thank you.